Cherry Audio tweeted out something interesting earlier today. They uh, had not a screen. They had a screenshot of two sequencers and a few other modules, and the tweet said, "Hey, you can connect these two sequencers, and instead of having two 8-step sequencers, you can link them into one 16-step sequencer." And I was like, well, that's interesting, but I don't see how this could actually work because there were a bunch of things not connected, and so I decided to give it a try. Now, this top row, let me zoom in slightly. We can ignore this second row for now. This top row are all the modules that they had in the tweet. The problem is the 8x1 switch was not really connected to anything, and the tweet didn't really say how any of this worked, so it just gave a hint. Anyway, I decided to put it together and figure it out, and basically I've set this up exactly the way they had. I did make a minor change or two, nothing major, and I of course added the second row, which has oscillator filter, some effects, just so there would be something to hear. But in fact, let me turn those off at the moment. Actually, let's turn it back on. Let's give this a listen, just for a moment, to see what the end result is. So here is the whole thing. Okay, now I added the effects, chorus and reverb, just to make it a tiny bit more interesting. In other words, I couldn't really help myself. So this is the basics. I've disabled the effects, and we will give this a listen. Let me zoom back in again. So the buttons module, it's interesting. There's a whole pile of utility modules from this company, and forgive me. B-Moon, that's it. This one happens to be free, but they make a really good set of modules, all kinds of interesting utilities. They make an interesting sequencer module. It's not one module, though. It's every bit of the sequencer is separate, and I'm going to do a video about that at some point, hopefully. So each step in the sequencer has its own module, and then there's clock modules, and it's really interesting. But anyway, I hadn't had anything of theirs before I'm doing this video, but this is a set of buttons. These 4 are momentary buttons, and the bottom 2 are click on, click off buttons. So it's actually unbelievably useful, and I wish I'd seen it sooner. So basically, this is the start button. Boy, do I miss that chorus and reverb, I tell you. Number 2 is the stop button. And number 3 is a reset button. So what I usually do is I make these guys up here stop, start, and reset, or something like that. The problem is that reset needs a voltage. It's not just a button. So you can take this button here and assign it to button 4. So now button 4 is this step forward. And let me unassign that. So that's really handy, but the problem is that the resets need a voltage. That is the point. So I could have done stop and start buttons 1 and 2 up here with the utility buttons. But the beauty of this module is that, and you can see, here I'm pointing with my finger at the screen, you can see this sequencer is on step 4, but if I click this and hold it for a moment, it sends a voltage. It actually sends a bunch of voltages. I'll get into that in a moment. So I'm going to click this, and now you can see that this sequence is back at step 1 where it belongs. So let's go through these things. So button 1 is the start, and that goes to the start of sequencer 1 and the start of sequencer 2. And, well, I'll get, hang on, I'm running ahead of myself. So stop goes to the stop of this sequencer and the stop of this sequencer. And the resets, I first started just sending a reset to the sequencer resets, but things were odd, and then I remembered, oh, I really should send a reset to the clock divider as well. And I figured, what the heck, I sent one also to the switch just so everything was guaranteed to be at step 0, quote unquote, when I started things up. So let me hit that again just for fun. So I love this little module. Basically, I'm just sending a voltage, some unknown voltage. I'm assuming it's 5 volts, but who knows. I'm sending that to all 4 of the reset buttons that are in use here. So really handy, and not something you can do with these buttons. What I've done in other videos is I had an envelope generator, and I would assign this button to there was a manual gate button on some of the envelope generators, so that's what I would do. But this way, I can just do it directly, and I don't need that extra module. So I always like that. Anyway, let's go through this. So what you're doing, fairly straightforward until we get to the end of the row. This is step sequencer number 1. 8 steps, and I just gave it 1 note. It's an A2. I have quantized the output so you get actual notes instead of very precise and hard to tune voltages. This sequencer is exactly the same to a point. It's a different note on the second note. That way you can tell which sequencer is playing at any given time. So they are the same, but where they start to diverge is this trigger out. So the trigger out of sequencer number 1, it's using its own internal clock. There's no external clock here. That would be this one. So I'm sending the trigger out to the clock of the second sequencer. That way the 2 sequencers are locked together. And I'm also sending it to the in of the clock divider. And this is as far as the Cherry Audio tweet took it. So there were a couple of things. I was like, well, how do you get from this 8 notes to this 8 notes? There wasn't any way that made any kind of sense in their tweet because they didn't say anything. So what I figured out was they had to have the clock divider in there for some reason. And this was also there. The output of the divider, actually, I think it was there. I'm not 100% sure. That, well, I don't know. I'm not sure that was there, but either way, it doesn't matter. So what I started to do was I took the output of the clock divider because, quote unquote, obviously, that was what they talked about in the tweet. They said the clock divider would drive the switch, and that would be the way you got 16 steps. But they didn't elucidate, so I didn't really know what to do with it after that. So what I did is I started playing around with it, and let me, in fact, bypass the oscillator too. I'm going to kickstart these. So if you look, this sequencer number 1 and sequencer number 2 are playing uh, the same steps at the same time. And I was like, well, what the heck? Why are you dividing the clock by 8? Remember, the clock is coming from the first sequencer. And why would the switch help you? And then I noticed that these two steps, what it's doing is it's switching from step 1 to step 2. And from there, I sat and thought about it for a couple of minutes, and uh, it suddenly hit me what they were doing. They are not at all making a 16-step sequence. What they're doing is they're playing both 8-step sequences at the exact same time, and you're only hearing one of them at a time. So right now you're listening to sequencer number 1, and then in a moment it'll switch to sequencer number 2. So it's like an total and utter cheat what they did, except it's just a hack of supreme brilliance. And heck, I wish I'd thought of it, but I did not. So don't know who thought of it, but it's just a brilliant idea. I've been doing this a while, and this sort of thing just never occurred to me. So either it's common knowledge and I totally missed it, or it's a brand new thing, and I don't know. But it's really ingenious. So let me go through it a little more slowly. So I'll stop this, and I'll reset it. And let me turn my oscillator back on. So here's what happens. Sequencer number 1, I'm going to trigger it individually. Let's make this go to one step. So what we're hearing, we're taking this CV output, and that is going to the input of the first switch. So right now, we're only hearing switch number 1, in a sense. And this, we're not hearing the switches. It's just passing the whatever's coming in to the output. And the output of that goes to the oscillator, and that's what's driving the pitch. So what happens is this sequencer, number 1, every time it hits the 8th step, because we're dividing the clock by 8, what happens is it only sends one pulse out every 8th step. And let me stop this. Whoops. When we make this 2, so what happens is, reset, this sequencer goes 8 steps. Then the clock divider says, okay, I've counted to 8. I will send out a clock. And what that's doing is it's triggering the switch to go to to the output, to send the output of whatever's coming into switch number 2. Let me rephrase that. Start that over. See, the output of sequencer 1 goes into switch number 1. See, the output of sequencer 2 goes into switch number 2. And what the switcher is doing is it's sending whatever is coming into switch 1 is going out until it gets a step trigger, which for this purpose comes from the clock divider. And then it switches and sends the output of sends out whatever is coming into input number 2. So we're essentially alternating between the two inputs. And you can set these, you can see these are now input 3 is active, now input 4 is active. But we'll go back down to 2. And the reason I added a reset here is because this is on step 2, and we want everything to be reset so everything is going at the same time. So now what we'll do is let's start it up. So now it's the first sequencer, and now it's the second sequencer. Oh, I got that backwards. First sequencer, and now the second sequencer. You can tell them apart because this is a lower note than this one. So that is the whole thing, and let me re-enable these just to make the sounds a little more interesting. 2 LFOs, one going to the filter cutoff frequency, another going to the resonance amount. And our chorus and our reverb. So that's it. It's utterly ingenious. So both sequencers are playing at exactly the same time. You do not have a 16-step sequencer. What you're doing is switching back and forth between sequencer 1 and sequencer 2. So you're faking 16 steps. And consider that this 8x1 switch has 8 different switch inputs. So you could have 8 sequencers all in a row hooked up together this way. You would have to, well, that would work fine. You'd need a lot of sequencers in here. But think of other alternatives. Both of these sequencers, sequencer 1 and sequencer 2, have 8 steps. But what if sequencer 2 and sequencer 3 had 7 steps? Or, you could go just totally crazy with this and have possibly different rhythms, or you could have a very long chain and have the fourth sequencer be the chorus and have the fifth sequencer be the verse. You can do just all kinds of things, and the possibilities are endless. I feel like I say that for every one of these voltage modular videos, but it's kind of true in a sense. So anyway, I just wanted to go through all of the steps, including the ones that they implied but left out. So, quick recap. The buttons module gives you voltages out, which I use to start, stop, and reset. Sequencer number 1 has some notes, but it's also driving sequencer number 2 and the input to the clock divider. So every 8 steps of the first sequencer triggers an output to the switch, which switches between inputs 1 and 2. And that, which sequencer you're hearing at any given time, is determined by which switch is active. And the output of control voltage goes to the oscillator, and then to the filter, to the chorus, to the reverb, and so on. So not incredibly complicated, but deviously clever, and I was glad I was able to figure out, and hopefully this explanation will be clear. And there you go. How to get 16 sequencer steps out of an 8-step sequencer or 2.